So we finished yesterday talking about motor neurons, talking about this midpoint in communication between the brain and our muscles. Okay. So remember, our big thing yesterday was that we need to be able to move to do physical activity, and muscles help us do that by generating force. And the thing that separates skeletal muscle from cardiac muscle and smooth muscle is that it is under our voluntary control. Okay. We most of the time have the opportunity to choose if something's going to get a muscle's going to get turned on and when it's going to get turned off. So the brain communicates out through these motor neurons and everything out to the muscle fibers. So the next piece of this, as we explore these connections, is we need to understand the functional units of how the nervous system can communicate with muscles. And this is done through the idea of something called a motor unit. Okay. So we talked yesterday that for every muscle in your body, in the spinal cord, there may be several hundred to several thousand nerve cells that are going to, or these neurons that are going to connect and communicate to a given muscle. Typically, the bigger the muscle, the more motor neurons it's going to have. Well, those motor neurons, each motor neuron is going to connect to more than one individual muscle fiber in a muscle. Okay, so we'll go back with my bicep. Let's say I have 500 motor neurons that are going to innervate or connect to my bicep. Okay, so if I've got, I don't know, we'll say 100,000 muscle fibers in my bicep, I've got 500 motor neurons that we have to distribute each of those fibers to. So the thing to know about a motor unit is that a motor unit is the structure where it's one motor neuron, its axon, the branches of its axon, and then every individual fiber in a given muscle that is going to be connected to that motor neuron. Okay? This is going to become really, really important as we move along today, because when we turn muscles on, when we use the nervous system to turn them on, we have to activate one motor neuron at a time, okay? And so in order to produce a certain very precise amount of force production, we're going to turn on one motor unit. If that's not going to be enough force for us, turn on the second, and then the third, and the fourth, and the fifth, and so on until the muscle is producing. We have enough muscle fibers contracting to produce the force that we want. Okay. So the other piece of this, there's really two other things that come into play here. Okay. Every motor neuron connects to more than one muscle fiber in a muscle. However, each fiber in the muscle is only connected to one motor neuron. So if I've got 10,000 fibers, each of those fibers only connects to one motor neuron, right? So that's kind of the organizational paradigm. Motor units are also going to come in different sizes. So we're going to have some motor units where the neuron connects to maybe 10 or 20 fibers, and then we may have some motor neurons that are going to connect to several thousand muscle fibers, okay? So we have small motor units, and then they're going to increase in size along a gradient going from small to a little bit larger to kind of medium size to pretty big to these giant motor units, okay? This is important as well because that's going to help us control the order in which each motor unit is going to get turned on during a muscle contraction, okay? And we'll talk about how that order plays out in the next couple of slides, okay? One other thing to remember here that I think is really, really important, okay? Each motor unit, all of the muscle fibers in each motor unit are all going to have the same fiber type, okay? They're all going to have the same fiber type. So if you remember from yesterday, we talked about that there are these slow twitch type 1 muscle fiber types. There are the fast twitch type 2A fiber types and the fast twitch type 2X fiber types. So in a certain motor unit, every fiber is going to be type 1, or every fiber is going to be type 2A or type 2X. And again, there's kind of a rationale behind all of this. Our smallest motor units, the ones that have the fewest number of muscle fibers, these small motor units are going to be connected to type 1 or slow twitch muscle fibers. The more medium-sized units are going to be connected to type 2A muscle fibers. And the very largest, the ones that have the largest number of fibers, are going to connect to type 2X muscle fibers. Okay? So we have small, slow twitch fiber motor units, medium to kind of medium large sized type 2A motor units, and then very large, and there are very few of them in most instances, these very large type 2X motor units. Okay? Are you guys with me so far on all of that? Because if we can understand that, then as we get into which ones get turned on and when, understanding why the slow twitch ones that are resistant to fatigue get turned on first it makes more sense and it becomes important. Okay, so those are motor units. All right, I'm trying to advance the slides. We mentioned this yesterday, and this is really just kind of an informational slide for you guys, but what this cartoon here, this picture shows is where are motor units for a given muscle typically grouped or located up and down in your vertebrae, in the spinal column. So like you can see, there's a very general sense that sort of neck and upper body kind of things move from top to bottom, basically. The motor neurons for the muscles like that are in your head and your neck tend to be highest in the spinal cord, and as you move your way down, then the motor neurons are going to move their way down. Okay, so most of our upper body motor units are going to be contained somewhere in the cervical vertebrae. Okay, and we're going to get a little bit of stuff for like our internal and external intercostals in our thoracic vertebrae, but for the most part, we don't have a huge number of motor units that are going to be distributed across the 12 thoracic vertebrae. And then a lot of our lower body muscle motor units are going to be in the lumbar spine or kind of down into the higher portion of the sacral spine. I'm not going to ask you guys any questions about that. You don't have to memorize or anything about like, well, you know, L3 is where most people have their knee extensor motor units. But for those of you that are interested in physical therapy, occupational therapy, chiropractic, or you're interested in kind of neurology as medicine, there are these very distinct patterns. When people have pain or weakness or numbness in a given place in their body, they have a hard time, they've had a stroke, right? Or they're having a difficult time moving a particular segment, we can oftentimes trace that back to where are those motor units located in the spinal cord. And that can give us some information about, do they have, you know, bone spurs or impingement or something in their spinal cord. And if they don't have it in their spinal cord, then that leads us to maybe they've got a problem, they've had a stroke, and it's in that particular area in the motor cortex or something. So we can trace things back from what we see like out in your hands. We can trace that back to a particular location in your neck. And that may give us some additional information about kind of what we need to do from a rehabilitation standpoint. Okay, does that make sense, guys? And y'all probably talked about all of that in anatomy and everything, but I think sometimes it makes sense, right? I have, from playing football in high school and smashing my face into people too many times, I have bone spurs from basically C4 to C7 vertebrae in my neck. I have narrowing in the foraminal space in where the nerves leave the spinal cord or they leave the vertebrae to go out to the periphery in almost every one of those. And a couple of years ago, I slept funny. And by sleeping funny on my neck, I had numbness and weakness and pain shooting down my neck, right across my anterior deltoid, down the middle of my bicep, right down sort of the inside to the thumb, okay, of my left hand. And this is basically something we would call, it's in the C6 dermatome. Like it is, you can trace everything back from where it is, right? That the fingers are in a different dermatome than your thumb, and it runs along the inside here, and it runs right up the bicep, but not the tricep. Triceps are more of a C7 kind of a thing, right up through here, and you could trace it back, and they knew where to look and kind of what to do for me with my neck. So we can do a lot of things because of all of this. So that's why I think it's important to at least have some level of appreciation for that there are motor neurons. That's where these nerves or these cells are located in your spinal cord, and then they're going to communicate with their axons out from there. Okay. Before we talk about kind of the overall process of turning muscles on, I want to introduce a couple of other structures that are going to be important in this process, and then we'll kind of loop back around to how we turn them on. Again, we have your motor neuron in the spinal cord. I'm trying to get the cursor up here. You have the motor neuron in the spinal cord. You have its axon that leaves the spinal cord and comes out, and it's going to go all the way down. And then where the axon is going to come into very close contact, it does not physically touch it, but it comes into close contact with each individual muscle fiber. That is going to be called, that location is going to be called the neuromuscular junction, or the meeting place between the nervous system and skeletal muscle. Okay. This is a very, very highly specialized structure. It's been very widely studied. We know a whole lot about it, but I'm just going to give you guys just a couple of basic things that are going on at the neuromuscular junction, and then leave the rest of that for Dr. Mike to talk about with you guys in exercise physiology. Okay. So at the junction, as I said, we do not physically make contact between the end of the axon and the surface of a muscle fiber. Okay. That's always seemed kind of weird to me, but that's just kind of the way that it goes. It doesn't make contact, so we don't have anything that can get torn loose and break. So what happens at the junction, if we look at a close-up of it over here in the right, what you will see then is that the end of the axon bulges out and forms this kind of bulb-like structure. Okay. It's actually called the bouton, which is neither here nor there, but it bulges out. And then on the muscle side down here, underneath that, you will see that the membrane or the sarcolemma of the muscle at the junction has all of these folds or clefts in them. Okay. Does anybody know why that might be a useful thing? Why would we want to fold the membrane on the muscle, and why would we want to kind of bulge out the end of the axon right there? It happens for a very, very useful reason. But does anybody know why that is?
To increase surface area?
Exactly, Lindsay. Increase surface area. Perfect. Okay. What this does, this is where structure helps us to impart function. By having a bigger surface area on the nerve side, it gives us more area to store and release a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. And then on the muscle side, having all of the folds gives us more surface area to anchor down receptors for acetylcholine. Okay. And so what this helps us to do is it helps us to ensure a very nice, tight transmission of our signal using the fewest possible acetylcholine molecules. Okay. Because the nerve has to make the acetylcholine, that costs it energy and things to make the acetylcholine. So it doesn't want to just dump a bunch of stuff out there and just kind of hope for the best. Okay. What it really wants is to have this very nice, tight, efficient transmission of a signal. So this is probably as good a place as any to talk about that on the nervous system side of things, okay, from the brain down the spinal cord to the alpha motor neuron and then down to the neuromuscular junction, the nervous system, for the most part, signals using electricity, okay? It does this because electricity travels really, really fast, right? You can think about snapping your fingers and you snap your fingers, right? And this signal gets transmitted at this, it's not exactly light speed, but it is almost as kind of fast as you can conceive of, okay? So we have a nervous system electrical signal. That signal is called an action potential, okay? It's called an action potential. Again, you probably did this in physiology. We could spend weeks talking about how we generate action potentials, how they get moved from one place to the next, the role of different ions and ion channels and a bunch of things. And all that stuff is really important. But for our purposes in class, all that we really need to care about is, does it work or not? Okay. Nervous system generates an action potential. That action potential travels from the brain to the spinal cord, to the alpha motor neuron, down the axon, and then at the neuromuscular junction, it switches from an electrical signal, an action potential, to releasing acetylcholine, to this physical neurotransmitter signal. Okay? Any questions about that? No? Okay. Then we're gonna keep moving on. So there's our action potential. All right. The next piece of all of this is we need to discuss, once the acetylcholine has been released and it binds to the acetylcholine receptor on the surface of the muscle fiber, well, what happens then? The actin and myosin are going to be contained. They're located down on the inside of those muscle fibers, down in those sarcomeres. And we need a way to transmit or move the signal from the outside of the fiber down into the inside. And so when acetylcholine binds to its receptor on the cell surface, we've had a physical signal that then generates it generates another action potential. So we're going to get an electrical signal that's generated on the surface of our muscle fibers. Okay, so nervous system signals via action potential. Neuromuscular junction signals via a neurotransmitter via acetylcholine. Then we're going to go back to an action potential. That action potential will move along the surface of the fiber membrane of the sarcolemma until it reaches a T-tubule, till it reaches one of those transverse tubules. Those T-tubules functions as tunnels, as we said yesterday. And that is going to allow that signal to move along the surface. It's reached a T-tubule. Now it's going to tunnel its way down into the inside of our muscle fiber. This is going to bring that signal down much, much closer to the actin and myosin in our individual sarcomeres. As we discussed yesterday, once the T-tubule gets depolarized, once the action potential reaches the T-tubule will signal for the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release calcium. That calcium then binds onto the regulatory that we discussed called troponin. It twists and changes its shape, and that pulls tropomyosin out of the myosin binding site on actin, and then now actin and myosin can bind together. Okay? And now we can get force, and now we can potentially get movement. Okay? So hopefully what you guys can understand from this is the process, okay, of going from I think about walking, I think about running, I think about any kind of movement, and then that signal has to get transferred out to the individual muscles. This is very much a multi-step process that involves multiple structures, okay? It's going to involve several hundred to potentially several thousand different nerve cells that are going to be located in the spinal cord. Heaven forbid you do a movement like walking where you have to have, hundreds of muscles contracting simultaneously. Okay. So this can be a very complicated thing. There's lots of places for this to get messed up and for this to go, something to go wrong. And thankfully, most of the time it doesn't. But the system is set up this way so we can have fast transmission of signals with action potentials. And we can also have very, very clear ways to turn things on and then turn things back off. Okay. At the neuromuscular junction, as soon as you release acetylcholine, and you're going to get sort of one set of action potentials then generated in the muscle, that acetylcholine is going to be broken off of its receptor. As it breaks off of its receptor, we're going to make use of a certain enzyme to do that. You have an enzyme that's located around those receptors. It's called acetylcholinesterase. Okay, acetylcholinesterase. And I will tell you why it's important to understand that class of enzymes in just a minute. But what this does is you release the acetylcholine, it binds, boom, action potential goes, and then almost immediately you break off the acetylcholine molecules, and so then that shuts off transmission to the muscle. Okay, so fast signal on, fast signal off, and that way if you want to do a sustained contraction, the nervous system has to consistently keep sending more and more and more and more of these action potentials down and release more and more acetylcholine. Okay. Oh, so we have a question via chat. What is the name of the enzyme again? It is called acetylcholinesterase, and I think it is it listed in here? Nope, it is not. Okay. So I'm going to type it, or I'm trying to type it in the acetylcholinesterase. Understanding the function of this enzyme or this class of enzyme is important because we have some really terrible chemical weapons that have been developed. There's something called sarin nerve gas, and it functions by blocking cholinesterase enzymes. And so what happens is if you're exposed to this nerve gas, then your acetylcholinesterase enzymes stop functioning. And so you're unable to relax a contraction, basically. And so that's how and why it ends up killing people, is that your diaphragm can't relax. And so it can't relax, so you can't continue to breathe. And so your body essentially just becomes one big muscle spasm, and you're just stuck like that until you essentially suffocate. Okay. There's also some neurotoxins. There's a particular kind of, I think it's the pufferfish that makes an acetylcholinesterase inhibitor. If anybody likes to eat sushi, if you go to China or Japan or Korea, I believe they will prepare pufferfish for you. And if the chef cuts it wrong, then you can be exposed to the neurotoxin, and eating that kind of sushi will kill you. It's very, very expensive to get to eat it. So that's kind of why understanding these classifications of enzymes and how everything works, I think, is going to be important. Okay, so let's go on to now a little bit more of the kind of overall process physiology portion of things. So we talked about this, that action potential in the T-tubule to the release of calcium. This is called excitation contraction coupling, or EC coupling. We're coupling together the excitation of the sarcolemma to the actual muscle contraction. So not really a huge number of things. This is just kind of, again, what we're calling that step, those kind of steps in the process there. Okay. We'll give you all a second to write. I feel like I'm talking very fast. All right. So there's some nice cartoons on all of this. There's some really useful, if you just go on YouTube and type in neuromuscular transmission, or you type in excitation contraction coupling, there's some really kind of nicely done um, cartoons or animations that are going to show all of that. I didn't put one in for excitation contraction coupling. I did put one in though for what's called the sliding filament theory of a muscle contraction, which we will talk about, which is what we're going to talk about now. Okay. Something in chat. Yes, Kiana, that's right. It is the name of what we just talked about. So that process of going basically everything after binding of the acetylcholine to its receptor to the point where we're going to get the interaction of actin and myosin, that is excitation contraction coupling. Okay, good question. All right, I appreciate you guys putting those in chat or whatever. That's always very helpful. If you don't want to ask in person, please feel free to do that. So this is here. You can watch this video. I'm not going to show it. I'm just going to kind of talk our way through this relatively quickly. But the general idea of the sliding filament theory of contraction is that we have actin filaments and we have myosin filaments. And that when a muscle contracts, those filaments slide past each other. Specifically, the actin filaments are going to slide towards each other and then slide past each other as the muscle shortens and shortens. Okay, so there's a process, or kind of some steps in this process that we need to know, if only because one step in this process of the sliding filament theory is going to be where we use energy during muscle contractions, and that's going to be where the energy elevation, the elevation of energy use, that's going to move us from resting levels into doing physical activity, where that's going to come from. Okay, so what you see here is, in the sliding filament theory of a muscle contraction, there's a sequence of events that are called the cross bridge cycle. Okay, probably useful at this point for me to tell you guys that when the myosin head grabs onto actin, when they bind, okay, that is called a cross bridge, right? The actual physical binding of myosin to actin forms a cross bridge. We cannot get movement or force production until actin and myosin form a cross bridge. So this is a very, very important event, okay, as we're trying to move. So what you guys see here in the cross bridge cycle, in the cartoon that is illustrating things here, at the top, this is step one, okay? What has happened here at step one is we've just released calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. It has just, that calcium has just bound to troponin, and we've moved tropomyosin out of the way. So myosin has just now bound itself onto actin, okay? So it looks like this. And you're just seeing what's happening with one myosin head here. You can imagine on the thick filament, there are thousands and thousands of these myosin heads, all of which may be grabbing on simultaneously. So this is just what's happening at one head, but you can imagine that this process is going on thousands and thousands or millions and millions of times, okay? So this is bound. When the myosin binds, the myosin is in what we call its high energy configuration. What that means is that when it binds, the myosin has a molecule of ADP, so adenosine diphosphate, and a single molecule of inorganic phosphate, which in the step at the end of the cycle, what has happened is ATP has been here and we've cleaved an inorganic phosphate off of ATP to make ADP. So we're here, okay? This is the high energy state. Myosin is in a position where it is like, I don't know how to describe it. It's basically like if anybody has ever shot a bow and arrow, It's like we've pulled the string back on the bow. We've kind of cocked it back. It's ready to be able to move. Okay. So it binds. Then the next thing that happens, okay, is the myosin is going to release the inorganic phosphate. That's going to trigger a process whereby the head of the myosin molecule is going to tilt. And as it tilts, it's going to then generate force and pull the actin molecule along. Okay? Once it is done tilting and pulling the actin molecule, it's going to then release the molecule of adenosine diphosphate. So it starts off kind of cocked in its original high energy conformation. Inorganic phosphate gets released, then it pulls, then it releases ADP. Okay. We now have something that we would call a rigor complex, which you don't have to know, but I think this is an important illustration. You now have myosin bound to actin where it's pulled the actin, and the myosin then is in what's called its low energy conformation or its low energy state. Okay. Here is where what I find to be maybe the strangest, most backwards thing in all of exercise physiology occurs. Okay. So up to this point, we've generated force, we've moved a little bit, but we have not actually used any energy in our process. Okay. Weirdly enough, when you use energy during muscle contractions, you use the energy to break the myosin head off of the actin. So the initial part of the contraction and the force generation does not cost us. We don't use any energy there, but we have to use energy to break myosin and actin apart. Okay? So it's in its low energy state. The ATP comes in. When the ATP binds, that breaks the myosin off of the actin. Okay? Then the myosin head is going to, it has an enzyme in there called an ATPase. It's going to break that ATP down into ADP, an inorganic phosphate, and that returns the myosin head from its cocked or from its kind of low energy state back up into that kind of fully cocked high energy state. Okay. So you don't use energy to contract a muscle, you actually use the energy to relax it. And when I do a normal muscle contraction, as I do a bicep curl like this, what's actually happening here is there are millions and millions of individual myosin contractions, pull, release, pull, release. So these tiny, minute little relaxation points as you go through this full range of motion. You can't feel it, but that's what's going on. Okay. Okay. To me, that's the most backwards thing in all of exercise physiology. You don't use the energy to generate force. You use it to keep generating it by breaking the actin and myosin apart. Okay. Questions about that? I promise you this will be something that will show up on the test where you have to go through and kind of draw out and understand kind of what is happening at each individual step. Okay, because it's really, really important. Okay, we'll come back later today and test how well you're kind of understanding all of that. Okay, so if that's how we're going to get from the brain telling the muscle to contract, okay, during any sort of movement, that process is happening over and over and over and over, millions and millions of times in kind of a short period of time. Okay. Your brain is going to send these kind of constant signals out to the muscle, millions of action potentials, millions of sort of signals across the neuromuscular junction, and then, millions and millions of these excitation, contraction, coupling events. And that's how we're going to end up using up a bunch of energy. Okay. So One thing to understand about this is the nature in which the nervous system tries to decide which muscle fibers contract at a given point in time. How the nervous system, in some ways, learns and knows that for me to pick up my phone weighs a certain amount, and if I want to pick up my phone and do something with it, that I don't need as much muscle, I don't need as much force as if I'm looking here in the apartment out here, as if I was to pick up like a bag full of books or something. Okay. So the process by which the nervous system systematically and very orderly turns on muscle to get just the amount of force that it needs is called recruitment. Okay, it's called recruitment. And so the idea recruitment really just means turning on. Okay, it really just means to turn on. And so it is going to turn on muscle one motor unit at a time. So the brain turns on one motor neuron, and if that doesn't get us as much force as we need, it turns on a second motor neuron, and then a third and a fourth, and it works its way all the way up until we have enough motor neurons turned on to turn on enough muscle fibers to generate the force that we desire at that particular moment. So you can imagine if you're lifting something that is really, really heavy and you are trying as hard as you possibly can to lift that, there's a very reasonable chance that you're getting very close to turning on all of the muscle fibers and therefore all of the motor units in that muscle. Okay. But when you do something that's a very light and it's very easy for you to do, you're only turning on a very small number, only recruiting a very small number of motor neurons and therefore a small proportion of muscle fibers. Okay. Does that concept make sense, guys? Okay. Does that concept make sense? You only ever want to turn on just enough muscle to do whatever activity you're doing. Have you guys ever tried to pick up a box that you thought was going to be super heavy, and then you picked up the box and there wasn't anything in it, right? And you really kind of overestimated how much muscle and how much force to generate with all of that, okay? Your brain is really, really good at estimating how much something is going to weigh, estimating how much muscle you need to turn on to be able to do whatever it is that you want to do. And it does that because as you move things from the time that you're a toddler up until now, the brain in many ways remembers in some ways kind of how to do all of those things. And so it's kind of this really fascinating way of doing things. And then it has the ability on the fly to make adjustments. Okay. I lifted something. I'm getting tired, and so I got to turn off some of my muscle fibers. It has this ability to turn on some new ones, and it can really kind of adjust force really, really carefully and very, very quickly as you go through and you do different kinds of movements. Okay.
So in that estimation process, before you pick something up, is it already starting to turn on? Okay.
So you can turn things on kind of so fast that maybe the muscles aren't turned on yet, but the brain already, I mean, it just kind of already knows, like, ooh, I got to pick this thing up. And like it already knows, okay, we're going to do this. We need to flex in the back, and we need to, also flex at the knees and bend over and grab it. And I mean, it's all of this stuff happens almost instantaneously. Okay. Almost instantaneously. And so the ability of the brain to kind of quote unquote remember how to do these things and remember sort of as you learn how to do them better and better, their ability to remember this is really important for learning how to do new activities. And it's also really important when we have people that have an injury somewhere or have had a stroke and they need to relearn how to use their right hand, or they've had an ACL tear and they're rehabbing from an ACL injury. They need to kind of relearn how and in what order to turn muscles on to do knee extension or to do stops and starts and those kinds of movements. Okay, and so You guys will see a little bit tomorrow, and then probably a little bit more on Monday, that one of the things that's really useful about doing resistance training or lifting weights is that the nervous system has this tremendous capacity to learn how to do different activities better. And so if you do something you don't normally do, your nervous system learns very quickly how to recruit better for that movement, and you get a lot stronger doing that movement very, very quickly if it's brand new for you. So like if you've never done, say, a squat, okay, in your entire life, then your body is not very good. Your nervous system isn't very good at turning on like your knee extensors and your hip flexors and things to do a squat. Within a couple of weeks, you're going to get, 50, 100 pounds stronger at doing it very, very fast, just because of your changes in motor unit recruitment. You've not gained any muscle or anything else yet. And so there's these big changes that are very powerful in the nervous system. And that's going to be important to kind of understand as we build onto these things. Okay. Okay. Excellent. Any other questions about that? Okay. So recruitment of motor units generally occurs in a very orderly fashion, and that orderly fashion is basically the same every time you contract a muscle. And it's going to go from you're going to turn on the smallest, the motor units that have the least number of muscle fibers, you're going to turn those on first. Okay. So every time I do a bicep curl, if I'm lifting a light weight, I'm going to initially recruit my small type 1 motor units until I get just enough force. And then if I want to go from lifting kind of a lightweight to a more moderate weight, I will turn on, right? I'll turn on those same type 1 units that I used the first time, but they're not going to give me enough force to be able to do the lift. So then I start recruiting some type 2A motor units to get more and more muscle fibers. And I do that until I get the desired amount of force. If I want to lift something very, very heavy, then I turn on all of the type 1s first, then the 2As kind of second, and then if I need to, then I will finally get into recruiting the type 2X motor units, these very, very large, very big motor units. And that will hopefully then get me very close to my maximal kind of amount of force that I can generate. Okay. So we recruit from slow to fast, or from small motor units to the largest motor units every time. So every time you do a certain kind of muscle action, your smallest motor units are getting turned on every time you do it. Okay. If that is the case, can you guys see some advantage to the fact that the ones that are always getting turned on are going to be these slow twitch type 1 muscle fibers?
They don't fatigue very fast.
That's correct. They do not fatigue very fast. And so that's good, because if they fatigued, if we went in the opposite order, where you did the type 2X ones first, you do like one contraction, and then those muscle fibers would be fatigued and you couldn't use them anymore. And so now after like one contraction, you've reduced your total ability to generate force by 5% or 10% or something. Okay. So that's the usefulness of recruiting the type 1s first. Okay. Also, because those motor units are very small, then it lets us have a better ability to create very small increments or fine gradations in the amount of force that the muscle produces. Okay. And so that lets us do things like write, okay, or type. You're not just, imagine that if you did not have the ability to generate that very small kind of precise amount of force to be able to write, and you're just like smashing your pen into your piece of paper or something. Okay. So there is a lot of functional utility to this recruitment order and this recruitment pattern that we have. It lets us limit fatigue and also maximize fine motor control, which is one of the things that separates us, right, as human beings from some other animals. Okay, primates have a lot of good fine motor control, but like your dog doesn't have a lot of fine motor control. One, it can't like grasp things, but they have less. Okay. All right. So we'll do a couple more slides and then we'll take a little break. All right. So this is just kind of a way to illustrate how we do this. We talked about recruitment order. Okay. The next thing that I want to get into, and this is one of those concepts where it would be really great if you guys have any kind of weights or something at home for you all to try to do a demonstration, okay, for yourself. And I may, as part of the first lab, because we can't do some things, I may have you guys try to come up with a creative way to do something like this at home and take a video of yourself and send it to me. But the other piece that we need to understand, when we generate movements, when you generate force and you get movements, as you move, then physics tells us that that movement is going to occur at a particular speed or a particular velocity, okay? And so what many of you probably intuitively know and understand, but maybe you've never thought about it in this kind of formalized way, is that there is a relationship between how fast a muscle is able to contract and the amount of force that you're able to produce during that contraction at a particular speed, okay? And so that relationship looks like what you see here, okay, where we have velocity here on the y-axis and we have force here on the x-axis. And so what happens is when you want to go really, really, really fast, when you want to do a very, very fast muscle contraction, okay? I'm doing curls really, really fast here. Nobody's watching, but that's okay. Doing these, boom, 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 really, really fast, okay? The faster you need to do a contraction, the lower the amount of force you can produce during that contraction. So at very high contraction velocities, force production is very close to zero. Force is very, very low, okay? And as you slow the contraction velocity down, you are able to generate more force during that contraction. So when you're lifting something that is very, very heavy, very, very near the maximal force capacity for that muscle, the movement when you're doing that is going to be very slow, okay? And so what I may have you guys do as part of lab is, even if you've got like a backpack and you've got some books around the house, or I don't know, you've got some like jugs and you're going to fill them up with water, you got some milk jugs, like put them in a backpack, and like I got 2 books and I'm going to curl my backpack and I'm going to go as fast as I can, and I'm going to put like 4 books in there and try to go as fast as I can. And you guys should begin to be able to see that the more force that has to be generated, then the lower the velocity is going to be, okay? So I have on here in some ways why this happens. For the purposes of our class, that's less important, I think, than just kind of understanding that when you go fast, you generate less force. We can really, really clearly illustrate that when we normally do our first lab, where we have everybody figure out what the maximum amount of weight that they can bench press is. I'm going to be honest, this is really disappointing for me. That's my favorite day of class that we have every semester, is I love watching people try to max out on the bench, especially because there's probably some of you that have never done a bench press before. And it is great and awesome and such a wonderful kind of learning experience because we can illustrate so many things. But you guys can see that as you near your maximum, when you're doing a bench press, you can't move the bar very fast. When it's light, people are just like flying around, ripping it out, and it gets really heavy, and their strain is going super duper slow. So it kind of drives this point home. Okay, so don't worry so much about the why that this can happen. It has to do with the mechanics of the cross bridges, that to go very fast, you have to break them apart very, very fast. And so at any instant in time, there's actually very few that are attached. So you're going to get less force. That's not a huge thing for you guys to try to work your way through. Okay, but I do want you to understand that, just that when I want to go fast, in general, when I want to go fast, I'm going to get less force production. Okay. And that has some important athletic competition implications that we'll talk about next. So I don't have the power curve in here. So there's an idea in physics, okay, where we can calculate a parameter called power, and power is force production multiplied by velocity. And so if you want to run fast or jump high or throw a ball very, very hard or hit something with a golf club or a baseball bat or spike a volleyball or kick a soccer ball, whatever your sport is, when we do those things, generally, we need to be able to maximize the amount of power that muscles can generate so that we can impart that power onto the bat or the ball or through our feet onto the ground so that we can run fast. And so when you can kind of generate something called a power curve, where what we figure out is that the highest amount of power comes from contractions that are at about a third of maximal velocity and about 2/3 of maximal force production. But if you practice going fast, doing things fast, you get better at it. And you can generate more force at somewhat higher speeds. And so you can train yourself to be more powerful. There are specific weightlifting exercises like a power clean or the clean and press or things that people will do. You can run sprints and you can train the body, you can train the nervous system to kind of shift what this curve looks like in order to let you run faster and jump higher and be more athletic in that particular way. Okay. All right. So let's stop here, okay? And then when we come back, I'm going to put you guys into groups, and we'll do a little bit of group work as we kind of move forward, okay? So what I'm going to do is I am going to